Of course, you've heard the common expression, the world's oldest profession, referring to prostitution, but it has no real historical basis. This term was coined by the young writer Rudyard Kipling while describing a character in one of his stories. As for the question of the oldest profession, which historians consider first, we'll come back to it at the end of this video. Stay tuned for a new episode where we will discuss prostitution, a history spanning thousands of years. You'll learn about various aspects of this profession, such as temple or ritual prostitution, which was prevalent in many ancient civilizations. This involves sexual acts dedicated to a deity or god of a specific temple, usually performed by temple workers, primarily women and sometimes men. For example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there is mention of Shamhat, a temple prostitute who tames Enkidu through sexual encounters over 6 days and 7 nights. There was also the practice of hospitality prostitution, common among certain northern cultures, where low population density led to the sharing of wives, sisters, or daughters with guests. In some cases, such as among the Kamchatka tribes, when men met their friends, they would consider it an honor to offer their wives or daughters for sexual exchange, helping to minimize the risks of inbreeding. Similarly, on the island of New Guinea, inhabitants sometimes offered their wives to foreign travelers in exchange for small gifts. Herodotus wrote about Babylon, where every woman had to visit the temple of the fertility goddess once in her life and offer herself to a stranger for any price he was willing to pay. This practice applied to women of all social classes. In contrast to Mesopotamia, Egyptian temple prostitutes were also entertainers, singing and dancing for their clients. Egypt's climate allowed them to wear minimal clothing, and it's believed that tattoos played a role in distinguishing them. Tattoos, such as dots and rings on their thighs, ankles, or wrists, often featured symbols of deities, demons, or even the god Bes. The Bible references who's in a dozen passages, particularly in the Old and New Testaments. In some of these accounts, sex with these women is considered payment for services, often involving material goods. It's interesting to note that the Bible doesn't categorically condemn prostitution. It's just one aspect of it. In ancient Greece, prostitution was a common practice and not stigmatized. You could categorize the women in this profession into several groups. First, there were porn, who were slaves that worked in brothels. Then came the hetters, who were highly educated courtesans, often associated with the elite and known for their wit and beauty. Finally, there were the phallic, concubines, or lower-class prostitutes who catered to the working class. These are just a few examples of the diverse nature of prostitution throughout history. It's crucial to understand that it encompassed various forms and was not universally condemned. In some cases, it was even intertwined with religious practices. This was a common business in Greece during that period, the women of public houses. They had low status, and their services were very affordable, costing as little as 1 obol, which was the price of 2 liters of cheap wine. The manager of the public house paid taxes to ensure it was regulated, and special officials monitored it. Another group was free sex workers who served clients in their homes, rooms, public baths, or even among the tombs. Usually, former slaves who had bought their freedom became free workers, and they were more visible on the streets. It was forbidden for ordinary Greek women to engage in such activities. Some of these women wore distinctive footwear that left footprints with the inscription, "Follow me." They also dyed their hair white and wore brightly colored clothing and cosmetics to attract attention. They were required to register and pay taxes. Finally, there were the hetters, the most prestigious women in this profession. The term hetters translates to companions. They were known for their education and were well connected. In most cases, prominent Greek intellectuals, philosophers, politicians, and military leaders had a hetaira as a companion with whom they spent their leisure time, engaging in intellectual and romantic activities. These women were independent and managed their affairs. The life of a hetaira was a prominent aspect of ancient Greek culture. Sculptors created statues of them, and ancient authors described their lives and musings. One well-known hetaira was Aspasia, who was the companion of the Athenian statesman Pericles. It is believed that she had a significant influence on her partner's decisions. Additionally, the story of Lamia, an Athenian hetaira who amassed a considerable sum of money and used it to restore an art gallery in the city of Sicyon, has been preserved. Such generous contributions from hetaira are not uncommon. It is essential to note that prostitution primarily involved women, but in ancient Greece, men also played a role in this profession, either as customers or, in some cases, as providers of sexual services. The term prostitution has Latin origins, and the practice in ancient Rome was different from that in Greece. Unregistered prostitutes, in contrast to registered ones, were known as lupa or she-wolf, and brothels were called lupaneria. To guide customers, phallic symbols were drawn on the streets. In the city of Pompeii, which had an estimated 20,000 inhabitants, there were about 25 to 35 such establishments. Typically, these were small two-story buildings with rooms on the ground floor, each measuring only about 2 square meters. The rooms were quite Spartan, with low, narrow beds along the walls and erotic frescoes and inscriptions on the walls. In Pompeii, many of these frescoes survived under the ashes of Vesuvius, preserving explicit erotic artwork. On the second floor, the rooms were a bit better, but still had no windows, and they were dimly lit even during the day. It could get stuffy and hot inside due to the small size and lack of ventilation, so lamps were needed to provide lighting, resulting in a smoky atmosphere. Frequently, people wonder why it was necessary to censor or cover explicit art depictions, which are considered pieces of art. Unfortunately, YouTube might not discern this and could impose sanctions on the video. All known erotic frescoes from Pompeii may fall under this category. They only opened their doors at the brothels from 3 p.m. onwards to allow young people time for attending school. The main times for visiting the brothels were in the evening and at night. Sex services were offered not only in the brothels, but could often be found in theaters, public baths, inns, and even in more extreme places such as under bridges, near mills, or stables. In mass culture, an image of orgies formed where Romans were entertained by prostitutes. This was widespread in both ancient Greece and Rome. Most of the prostitutes were foreigners, and men usually took on the role of prostitutes, especially in ancient Greece. Very rarely did women engage in their services. The term prostitution has Latin origins, and in ancient Rome, it was mainly a female profession. However, during the 13th century, the attitude towards sex work became more negative with the rise of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. Prostitutes began to be seen as immoral women to avoid. One of the most famous sex workers in history was Theodora, the Byzantine empress and wife of Justinian. By the time she met the emperor, she had already left this profession. However, her enemies constantly reminded people of her past. Theodora defended the rights of her former colleagues and sought to limit access to prostitution for minors. She also fought against male prostitution, increasing punishments for it. In medieval Europe, the church officially condemned prostitution, but in practice, it turned a blind eye because it realized that the sex trade reduced demands for extramarital affairs, incest, and homosexual relationships. In the 13th century, secular authorities started to regulate the sex trade to make it economically beneficial for the cities. Special districts, known as red light districts, were created to help people easily locate public houses. They used to hang red lanterns in these areas, giving rise to the term red light district. In some places, the color red was also used for prostitutes' clothing, as it was believed to hide skin imperfections such as pimples and rashes. Municipal authorities regulated the operation of these brothels, regularly conducting inspections. In some cities, they had statutes that prohibited accepting married, sick, pregnant, or minor women. Single women could only enter the profession with their consent. Brothel owners were required to allow their employees to attend church services, and dedicated areas for them were even set up in churches. Prostitution was limited to its district, and prostitutes were not allowed to solicit customers in other areas of the city. Some cities even had specific regulations regarding the attire of sex workers. For instance, in Bern, prostitutes were required to wear red hats. During the 15th century, there was an increasing backlash against prostitutes, and their work started to face opposition. Some brothels and public baths closed down. Attacks on sex workers became more frequent. Prominent preachers called for action against the trade, and some stopped working. These changing attitudes eventually led to a significant transformation in the sex work industry. At the end of the 15th century, another transformation occurred with the arrival of a phenomenon from across the ocean, which drastically changed this profession. We will discuss this in the next episode. Lastly, at the beginning of the episode, we promised to talk about the oldest professions, as referred to by Kipling, which include hunters, doctors, stonecutters, barbers, soldiers, and shamans.